My name is Richard Stephan. I went to school at Georgetown University and I got a master's in international affairs, which basically was a triple major. It was economics, political science, and history. I did my circumnavigation in 1973 during the summer, and I started out in May, ended it up at the end of August, between my junior and senior years. I started out on May 29th and I got to England. Okay, so that was country number one. Country number two was France, then Luxembourg, then West Germany, then East Germany. Mind you, those were separate countries back then. Then Switzerland. And I'm using the terminology that was in place back then rather than what these countries are called nowadays. Then I went to Austria, Hungary, Romania, Egypt, Lebanon, Iran, Afghanistan, India, Nepal, Thailand, Malaysia, Malaysia, Singapore, Hong Kong, Japan, and that was it. I was the third recipient of the grant. So at that point in time, all of the grants were being sponsored by the New York chapter. So everything's there. There'd only been three of us, so they had all been sponsored by the New York chapter. And the topic of my circumnavigation was the influence of young people in foreign countries. And I probably need to give you a little bit of background on that, because if you think today that America is divided across political lines, in the 70s, we were still divided, but along different lines. The division was really in generations. In other words, there was a very clear differentiation of interests and thoughts and beliefs between people who were under 30 and over 30, to the point where it was very painful. And it's funny, we talk so much about the division of America today, but we were very divided back then, just along different lines. And so the purpose of my study was to try to get underneath that and see, well, is this an American problem or is this an international problem? And how does this play out overseas? In the beginning days, I think the foundation was feeling its way around what they wanted to do with this trip. I mean, they knew they wanted to send somebody around the world. They knew they wanted them to do a study, but they hadn't really fleshed out, how extensive the study was going to be, and what kind of research you were going to do and what you were going to produce afterwards. So basically, in 1973, I think it's fair to say that the trip actually was the study grant. In other words, you had a topic, and you were supposed to research this topic. And the way you did this was to find people in the embassies locally, people in universities locally, students locally, people that you happen to meet locally, people who are traveling, and get their reaction to your topic and get their views. And so you were really kind of like a reporter, right? You were really getting an opinion from everyone that you met. And at the end of the trip, you kind of had to synthesize this information and form some conclusions. So I really do think that the trip was the study, and you couldn't divorce the two. My topic actually narrowed because I realized that I had taken on a very, very broad subject. And so I decided to focus really, instead of just focusing on what was going on with the different generations internationally, I decided I would focus on the political and economic impact of young people in foreign countries, because that was something that was much more observable. You could talk to people about it, you could pinpoint their ideas on it. So my topic actually got narrower, and I think probably a little clearer as the trip progressed. And I realized that I was starting to see patterns in various places that, to some extent, that the generation gap that we thought was such a problem in America was almost a luxury, because you didn't actually see this once you got out of the developing world. The less developed a country was, the less there was a difference between the generations, because the younger people were working just as hard as the older people, and they didn't have time for the luxury of thinking about, well, what does my generation really need and want? So it was funny. It's like you start developing a consistent pattern, or you start seeing and observing a consistent pattern as you're traveling and meeting all of these people. There's a broader issue too. I think when you travel like that, or when you travel the way we did, back in the 70s, you're meeting so many people overseas, and so many wonderful people, that you develop this huge appreciation for really all of humanity. In every country that you traveled in, you met people who were interested in the same things. They want food security, they want housing security, they want to be safe when they go home at night. And so you sort of develop the notion that people are the same everywhere, basically, and want the same things, and that we should all be treated with respect, and we should treat them all with respect. Back then, there was a lot of uncertainty about travel. You really had no idea where you were going to end up. I mean, you knew you were going to Bucharest, but you didn't know what hotel you were going to stay at. You didn't know if there was going to be a hotel. And that wasn't so bad as long as you were in Europe. But starting out, you were kind of terrified. What happens when I get to Cairo? And things are really different than they are here. And the funny thing is, that for me was when the trip really woke up and became a totally wonderful experience, because you were kind of afraid of all the uncertainty that you were going to have to deal with in the future. But once you got to these places, they were fascinating. The people were fascinating. The whole experience was just different enough to keep you constantly alert and interested. And it made you more self-reliant. Well, I have to say, traveling was very different in 1973 than it is now. I don't think people who are traveling today, who are a lot younger than I am, could even fathom that in 1973 you had a paper ticket. The ticket was written by hand. You didn't have credit cards, you had traveler's checks, and you had to make your reservations ahead of time. You had to go into when you were, let's say you got to country number one and you're going on to country number two, you had to confirm your reservation at an office. You literally walk into an office and confirm your reservation for the next country. Hotels were different. When you got to a country, you would go to a tourist office where they would assign you a hotel. And mind you, we were traveling on a very low budget, so you were, assigned a hotel, and it was a very different world. We didn't have phones back then, or we didn't have iPhones certainly. So you were at the mercy of whatever telecommunications you could find in a particular country. And I wrote postcards. That's how I kept in touch. It was funny. I noticed that kids are keeping blogs nowadays, which I think is absolutely wonderful. But I wrote postcards, and I think I sent Ray Dinsmore was the fellow who was kind of spearheading the whole effort at that point in time. I was going into places that were more and more different from any place I'd ever been before. And you develop as an individual as that happens. And I recall when I was in Hong Kong thinking, my gosh, I've crossed all of Asia, and having wonderful experiences, very interesting experiences. And yeah, I think that really enhanced the whole fellowship. I think being a circumnavigator means that you have an appreciation for other people in the world, really. Appreciation for other cultures, other countries, other backgrounds, and really an appreciation, as I think I said before, that people are basically the same over the world, and we all want the same things, and we all should be treated with respect. Well, Ray Dinsmore is wonderful. I think we all know that. Anyone who ever met the fellow or worked with him or had any dealings with him, whatever, he was such a kind individual, such a considerate individual. He really cared about each of us, not only during the circumnavigation, but afterwards, years afterwards. He would be like another family member. Yeah, you kind of looked to him for guidance, for inspiration, And I think all of us who knew Ray just thought the world of him, but not just Ray, people like Bill Geyer, the other, people who were involved at the beginning of the program. I think they were just all so helpful, and it was nice to see that they were interested in young people. Helen Jost was wonderful. She was the backbone of the program. It's funny, when I first met her, I didn't really know what she did. And, you realized over the years that she was the one who was kind of keeping this whole thing going. I had the pleasure of working as a treasurer for the foundation for several years. And it was just, gosh, she was always on top of things. She always knew what was going on. She was always pushing things forward. She had a great attitude. She was a wonderful person to work with. And I was very sorry to hear about her passing. I think Greg was really the kind of like the person who started this whole thing out. He was the first grantee. He helped Bruce Magid, and his giving him guidance as to what to think about in obtaining the grant. Bruce helped me. I helped Brian Evans. So it was kind of a chain of people who were helping each other as this thing was evolving. And Greg was really the person who started this whole thing off from that perspective. And I'm glad to see that, he is still involved. Brian Evans is still involved. So it's nice to see that, and I know some of the other grantees have been a big part of the foundation over the years as well. I was kicked out of Czechoslovakia. I got to Czechoslovakia. They gave me a hotel one night. The next morning, I went to the tourist office, and they said, "Get out. There's no hotels in the country. You have to go." So, and just think about that happening nowadays. Now, the framework here is Czechoslovakia was controlled by Russia back then. All right, so they didn't really want U.S. visitors at that point in time. But literally, okay, so you're in this country, and you're basically told by the governing powers to get out. So I had to totally change my plans and so on and so forth. But, the process of doing that makes you just so much more self-reliant. It builds your confidence, and you end up being a much tougher individual at the end of the trip than you were at the beginning of the trip. The whole experience of being in Eastern Europe it's hard to explain how depressing it was, because you had been in Western Europe, and then you crossed the bridge into Eastern Europe. Even going into East Berlin in those days was frightening, because you kind of went back 20 or 30 years in times in terms of economic quality of life. And these people were not being served by their government. They were not being told the truth by their government. There was repression. They weren't getting news. So I think the overall veil of government, I'm going to use the word repression, it was just very, it was eye-opening. And like I said, it was kind of a very bad point, being kicked out of a country for no good reason. But I guess it helped me understand, that you really never appreciate what happens in America, in Western Europe, until you go to a place like Eastern Europe in the 1970s and see that the people really don't have the basic freedoms that we take for granted. I was on this bus. For some reason, I decided that I wanted to see Isfahan because it's one of the most spectacular archaeological sites in the world. And so I was on this bus, and we were actually going back. It had been a long, hot day, and I was sitting there. You have to think bus. This was just a bus, right? It was just regular people in Iran. So this was not tourists. It was just me and whoever else happened to be going from Iran, from Isfahan back to Tehran that day. The fellow in front of me he had a turban, right? So obviously a local person. And this bus was not air conditioned, so all the windows were open. So we were speeding along, and this guy's turban flies off. Well, I just, catch the turban, and I then sort of hand it back to the fellow in front of me. And I figured, well, maybe he'll be appreciative. Well, the next thing I see, again, all I'm seeing is the back of his seat and his head, So what I can see is in his left hand, a big shiny knife comes rising out towards the ceiling. And I was going, oh my God, I've insulted this guy. I've broken some sort of taboo against touching someone's turban. And, I'm thinking, well, that's the end of the trip. But then, after what seemed like forever, in his right hand, I could see a cucumber coming out. And then he turned around and he offered me a slice of cucumber. So, what I thought was going to be an international incident turned into this fellow graciously thanking me for rescuing his turban. And again, to me, that's communication. It's, don't jump to conclusions. Don't assume that the person in front of you is going to hurt you. They really, people are more the same than you really think. To me, the biggest learning experience was when I got to Afghanistan. I had taken a class called Modern Foreign Governments back at Georgetown, taught by the very wonderful Jean Kirkpatrick, who unfortunately is no longer with us. And that class was about the range of countries that exist in the world in terms of their different levels of development, their different levels of sophistication of government, how they're functioning and such not. And it's one thing to see that in the classroom, but it's another thing to see it playing out in the real world. So I got to Afghanistan. Afghanistan had had a king for 25 years. All right. So this poor king, who everybody hated, by the way, took a vacation. And the day after I arrived in Afghanistan, they overthrew the king. So here I was in the middle of a revolution, all right? We knew that this socialist named Mohammed Daoud had taken over the country, kicked out the king, and pretty much that's all we knew. So we were in the middle of parades, and they were kind of gentle riots, but nonetheless there were riots. The airport was closed. We couldn't leave the country. The American embassy was closed. We didn't know what was going on. So here we were in, Newsweek described Afghanistan at that point as a country that was about to spring into the 16th century. So here we were in this very undeveloped country, unable to leave, not really knowing what was going on, and witnessing a revolution. It's not the kind of thing you expect to happen on a trip, but I was studying government, and here was an example of a failing government right in my face. And to me, it was one of the most memorable travel experiences I've ever had and probably ever will have. Most of the time, we weren't scared because the people seemed to be in a good mood. And there were kind of tanks running around and jeeps running around, and people were yelling and fireworks and so on and so forth. And we kind of spent a lot of time up on the roof of the hotel watching it all. The only scary moment is we were up on the roof watching what was going on outside, and a couple of jeeps pull up to the hotel. The guys get out, go in our hotel, and drag one of the guests out. To me, that was the only moment that it got scary because we didn't know what they were looking for. And we were okay. Well, we're kind of getting tired of this revolution, and maybe it would be a nice time to leave. Fortunately, a couple of days later, someone came to our hotel and said, "The airport's open, get out." So everyone was told to leave. We ran to got to the airport as quickly as we could, and then just took off. But we were there for a week in this period of uncertainty and not really knowing what was going on. The sad thing about Afghanistan was that people at the time, they just hated the king. He had just been, taking all the money from everyone, and it was all going into his personal bank account. The country was desperately poor. And so people were really excited that someone who purported to be a socialist was taking over and things were going to get better. And okay, this was 1973. They didn't get better. They got worse and worse and worse. And look at where Afghanistan is today. It's heartbreaking, especially having been in that country and met people and talked to people. And, they were friendly and kind, just like people are almost everywhere. And to see that it just has gone the wrong direction for them over this entire span of time, it's just heartbreaking. My last stop on the trip was Japan. And maybe it was just because it was the last stop, but I actually fell in love with the culture of Japan. I thought the people were wonderful. I met a woman, in Tokyo, they have these little lunch counters and they have plastic replicas of all the food. So you could point at this because you don't have no idea what it's called, but you could point at something and, pick that out as your lunch. And I was sitting next to this woman and we just started chatting and, she spoke wonderful English. Well, the next thing I know, she's inviting me home. We're in her house with her family having a tea ceremony and just, this wonderful sense of hospitality, and she told, we talked all about her culture and, the history of Japan and her history growing up. Also, I had been to Kyoto, which is a really wonderful place to go to. Anyway, so I had kind of fallen in love with Japan. And when I got back to Georgetown, I took an intensive language course in Japanese to the point where I was conversant in Japan at the end of that year. The trip, I think, increased my desire to do something overseas to the extent that I was willing to learn a very difficult language to help prepare myself even more to do that. Studying Japanese is very difficult. I don't know how familiar you are with the language, but there's 3 different alphabets. There's a different colloquial language. If you're talking like you and I would be speaking differently than I would be speaking to my grandparents, than I would be speaking to someone who is a senior official. It's a very complicated language. It has the Chinese kanji, which there are hundreds and hundreds of characters. So it's a very difficult process to study that language. But I have to say, every time I've spoken to a Japanese person in Japanese, they've almost just fallen over because they couldn't believe an American would bother to learn their language. And I think they are so appreciative of the effort that you made. And on a broader note, since I was actually fluent in Spanish, in my working career, and many times I was able to converse in Spanish. We conduct business meetings in Spanish. And people really appreciate the fact that you are speaking their language. It's something I wish every American could know. Singapore was kind of a mandatory stop because the fellow who was, I guess, the chapter president at Singapore was a very supportive person, and he would kind of take you under his wing. I remember he had a carpet factory, so he gave me a tour of his carpet factory. And that was really a high point of the trip because you kind of felt like you were there with somebody who you'd already known. Really, I had the same experience in Cairo. There was a circumnavigator in Cairo who invited me to his office and we chatted and he told me about the local situation. So it was kind of nice to meet circumnavigators along the way who could give you the benefit of their experience locally. I don't know if I would have gone into an international career if I had not done the circumnavigation. I think that's a fair, just a fair thing to think about because at the end of my studies at Georgetown, I knew I didn't want to go in the Foreign Service. If I hadn't had the circumnavigation, I'm not so sure that I would have been propelled into international business. I might have just gone into law or something else. At the time, I recognized that people in Foreign Service, the people who were in the actual Foreign Service were not really being promoted into the higher positions. Ambassadorships were being given to movie stars and people who really had no political understanding. So I thought that you could make more of an impact being a business person than you could being in the government or even being a lawyer. In retrospect, that may have been a mistake because there's certainly an area of international law that you could go into. But at the time, I thought that the argument for business was more compelling. I left Georgetown in 1974. We were in the middle of a very bad recession, so nobody was getting jobs. So the next thing I did was to go to business school. I went to the American Graduate School of International Management out in Arizona and got a master's in international management. And that's what really started my career. My first job was with the Foreign Credit Insurance Association in New York. We were underwriting trade deals for U.S. exporters. And then I started working for Bank of America, also in trade finance. And for a while, I was doing corporate lending at Bank of America, but they decided to send me, I'm not really sure why, but they decided to send me to London, where I was following Swedish corporations. I was also the country manager for Sweden. And so that was when my international career really took off. So I was living in London. I was following Swedish, Danish, and Norwegian companies and traveling there sort of pretty much every other week. I started learning Swedish, as you wouldn't be surprised to hear, because I thought it would help. And I once again, the Swedes really fall over when you try to speak their language because nobody does. So that was a great experience. So I was in London for several years. I came back and began work for Moody's Investor Service. And basically, they hired me because they wanted somebody who could work overseas. I mean, I didn't start working for them overseas right away, but a few years later, they sent me back to London. And I was at that point in charge of the corporate office for really all of the ratings that we were doing for the European area, all the corporate ratings that we were doing for the European area. And I did that for several years, came back to New York, and then they sent me back. And my last job for them in London was to be the chief credit officer for the corporate ratings group, basically all over Europe. I felt that I was so fortunate to have the experience of having the grant because it just gave me a perspective into international affairs, development, whatever you want to call it, internet, just people in different countries that I think so many people don't have. It's funny, where I live, so few people have been overseas, and so few people have had these experiences. And I think that's what brings people to these crazy ideas of what's going on in foreign countries that aren't true. But having been on the ground as a young person and talked to people all over the world, like I said, you realize that we kind of all want the same things. It's funny, I suppose there was a certain element of the intention of the founders of the grant that it was supposed to help us develop as individuals. That was never stated as the primary goal, but it must have been in the back of their minds that we'll give these guys a little rope and see how far they can carry it. At the beginning of the trip, I just wasn't convinced I could even do this. I mean, you're kind of staring at 90 days of travel under difficult conditions, and you're not really knowing that you could pull this thing off. And every country you went to, your confidence increased a little bit more. And you were in all these different circumstances, meeting all these different people. And my confidence grew and grew and grew. And by the end of the trip, I realized that, yeah, I could do this. And not only that, I could work overseas, I could live overseas, I could, deal with other people. To me, the most essential thing you learn on a trip like this is communication. It's how to talk to people, how to deal with people, how to listen to people, and try to understand what they want and what their needs are. And to me, that was the most important thing that I got from this trip, was just the understanding how to communicate with other people from different cultures. I think one of the impacts of the foundation fellowship is that it just makes you an international traveler. I mean, let's face it, the circumnavigators are a group of people who love to travel overseas. I mean, that's really one of their main things in life. If you talk to any single one of them, they love all the places they've been to. They love the experiences they have. They have a deep appreciation for international cultures. And you become that too. At the end of your trip, that's what you've become. And I was awarded or I was given a membership at the end of my trip because I had then gone around the world. And so you kind of become an international traveler, and it's something that's hard to stop. If you have a curiosity for the world, it never stops, and there's always one other place you want to see. I think I've been to 45 countries. It's hard to keep track because some of them aren't countries anymore, and some of them it's like the Czechoslovakia, right, is now the Czech Republic, and Slovakia. so I only went to half of it. But anyway, but it's about, I've been to 45 countries in my life, probably more. Well, I think the program has changed very much, so I don't know how relevant the advice I would give for future scholars is. I think there's a lot more structure in the program than there was when I was doing my circumnavigation. I would have wanted a program advisor at Georgetown to go over the topic and talk about how I was going to address it and what statistical information I should have done beforehand to support it. I would have done a lot more statistical work ahead of time so that I would have had some idea, rather than going into it kind of blind. So I think some of the preparation would be different, and I think some of the support from the university would be different. But I think they're probably already doing that now, as far as I can tell from the reports that I've looked at. It's 90 days of your life. An important summer. You're young, you're open to ideas, you're meeting all kinds of people. It's an experience that's going to stay with you forever. You're not going to forget it. And yeah, sure, it's going to inform things that you do for the rest of your life. The magic and the mystery are still there. I happened to read the blog of the young lady who, I don't know if she's traveling now or she was just traveling, and it's interesting. Her reactions to the experience of being overseas are pretty much exactly the same that I was having. The experience of having your eyes open to this different world and what people are actually saying as opposed to what you thought they were going to say. So I think the excitement is still there, and I'm very glad to see that. I live in Kentucky now, so my involvement with the foundation is really, donating, from time to time, and trying to help, keep the project going. And I'm so impressed that it's been going on for 50 years now, or a little over 50 years now. I'm so impressed with the quality of the individuals that they're getting, the quality of the research topics that they're doing, the experiences that they're having. So, I've really wanted to support it financially as much as I can. Unfortunately, living in Kentucky, we don't have a chapter here, so it's difficult to attend the functions, although I have attended some functions over the years. I'm so thrilled to have been involved with the very beginning of this program. I think it was a miracle that they chose me for the grant, and I appreciated it back then. But I didn't really understand that this thing was going to evolve and develop and grow, and just continue to attract outstanding young people over the years. And so it to me, I just, very thrilled to have been involved at the initiation of this program. And, now that it's like 50 years later, that actually I'm thrilled that I'm still around. I just hope that, I've expressed the depth of the appreciation I feel for the, really the people who started this foundation, who started the grant program, and, for the people that have kept it going over the years, because I know it's meant a lot to me. And I can see in the work that you all have done, and in the blogs and the information that's on the website of the foundation, that people are still getting a lot out of it, and that it's still attracting a lot of really outstanding young people. So I really thanks to everyone who's participated in that.